Mark, what is your definition of constructive journalism?
So there's a lot of jargon, I think, that's been flying around this subject matter for the last couple of years. Some people speak of constructive journalism, some of solutions journalism, positive news. I think all the terminology is slightly problematic. For me, this is a genre of journalism that asks the question, where did it all go right? And the reason for doing that is to try and give audiences and readerships a sense of the answers, the solutions, the possible ways out of all these multiple crises that we seem to find ourselves in these days.
And why did The Guardian as a whole start to move towards constructive journalism? What was the trigger? What was the catalyst for that?
Well, I've sort of traced this back, and I can't think of anything more original to say than the internet revolution. I mean, the internet has multiplied by an exponential factor the amount of traditional news out there. I don't want to speak of negative news, but fear-inducing news, alarming news, challenging news, worrying news, to the extent that both editors and audiences really can't cope. They're buried under this mass of this torrent of, how worried should I be? Very worried is the answer. And for me and for some of my peers, including the editor-in-chief at The Guardian, that became a really noticeable problem in sort of the middle part of the last decade, when we had a succession of events that really felt like, we're all doomed. And yet we knew we weren't. And so we really wanted to come up with something that balanced out that negativity and gave people a bit of hope, a bit of agency, a bit of a reason to get up off the sofa and take some action to try and confront some of these challenges. And for me, personally, and some of my colleagues might disagree with this, the overwhelming negativity of news in and around the middle part of the last decade was directly responsible for some of the political events that we saw happening. The Brexit referendum, the Trump election, the rise of populism. These, for me, were all manifestations of the fact that news had just become so overwhelmingly negative that people began voting with their feet. And I wanted to do something about that, to show people that it's not all over. We're a very ingenious, innovative species. We do care, we do have compassion, and there's a tremendous amount of great work being done that we need to tell readers about.
But in introducing that kind of journalism to the Guardian readership, did you come up against any opposition from what I would call the old dogs in the newsroom, who say, well, we've always done it a different way, we've always homed in on the negativity, that's what creates the stories that people want to watch and read about. And so, therefore, we are against this emphasis on constructive journalism. Was there a debate in the newsroom about this?
Oh, there was definitely a debate, and there were definitely lots of views. And the first view I entirely agreed with, which is that we can't stop doing investigative news. We can't stop doing the traditional news approach. News is a way of giving people information to make better decisions about their lives. And we can only do that if we dig out what's going wrong. But having done that, we also need to show people what can be done about it. So, yes, I had that school of thought in the newsroom. I also had colleagues who say to me, Mark, you will be inundated with PR and you'll never be able to get out from underneath it. And they were right as well. That does happen. You get a lot of mail shots from companies who want you to write about their latest app that's going to change the world.
And you have to learn to resist that.
You have to learn to resist it, to ignore it, to be very careful in the way that you go about engaging with that material. I was fortunate that I also had an editor-in-chief who kind of was thinking along the same lines, and in a very well covered address that she gave 3 years ago, her first new priority of her tenure was to offer readers hope, not just criticism. And for me, that was very much a kind of wind in the sails of the series we were about to launch called The Upside, which sought to do exactly that.
And did that require a change in the way the newsroom was organized, in the way people were thinking? Was it a way in which you had to, as it were, try very hard to create a new ethos in the newsroom, which would enable you to deliver that great mix of investigative journalism alongside the solutions part of it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, you'll know as well as I do that newsrooms have their own very special, very dominant culture. That there aren't many optimists in a newsroom, and that no one ever won a Pulitzer Prize from writing a good news story. So it was.
There's a challenge for you.
Yeah, well, we did win the first Constructive Journalism Prize a couple of years ago, which was nice. You have to go about these things. If you're going to change the culture of a newsroom, you have to do it slowly and you have to do it by example. There was certainly no way that we were going to completely tear up the news operation and put a constructive news editor at the head of it. That wasn't what it was about. Our plan was to start doing this work, to learn while we did it, to try and bring as many Guardian staffers into this genre as possible without creating a separate structure, because separate structures always sort of wither and die, and to sort of spread the word so that there will come a point where the upside is no longer a sort of ring-fenced part of Guardian journalism. It's spread throughout all the operation. And I would say that this past year in 2020, ironically, in the midst of one of the most negative stories we've ever seen, that this process of proliferation has really accelerated in a most heartening way.
And you've got a good reaction from your readers to that.
Readers love positive news. Readers love constructive journalism, but we should also be clear-sighted about this. They still click on negative headlines. Bad news still sells. Big bad headlines on the front of newspapers will shift more copies than something more constructive. There's no doubt about that in my mind.
Unless it is a revelatory headline that makes people say, wow, that's fantastic. I want to know more about it.
Absolutely. And so I'm not saying that we're always playing second fiddle or that we're always second best. I'm just saying that human nature, I still think after 3 years of doing this work, that human nature is still hardwired to click on an alarming headline to see how worried should we be. But at the same way that bad news sells, so do Big Mac and fries. But you can't give it to people 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. You know, it's not good for them. So readers do love both. Readers want both. Readers have written to me this year during the COVID crisis saying, this is all very well, and thank you for telling me that we're all doomed, but you know, can you tell us about some of the good stuff going on as well? To which the answer has been a resounding yes, and we've done that in spades.
And you do that as editor of The Upside, as you call it.
I do that.
Series of articles. How did that come about?
Well, The Upside came, we launched that in February 2018 as a result of these conversations about what can we actually do to try and pioneer this kind of work and to seed it within the newsroom. And the operations changed over the past 3 years. To start with, I was probably editing and publishing 5 or 6 bespoke Upside pieces a week. And then I sort of started to get the feeling that this isn't really what we want to do. I want to work with my colleagues. I don't want to sort of become a parallel news publishing operation. So now I will talk to my colleagues on the foreign desk and the national news desk and say, here's a good thing. Shouldn't we be looking at, you know, why Taiwan's been so amazing in the COVID crisis, or why dogs suddenly been the success story of 2020, and sort of work in parallel with them, because the idea is that I don't think a successful new news genre can be, as I say, a ring-fenced operation or all about one person. Everyone has to get it, otherwise it won't last.
So it's picking the upside where possible and where it is a good newsworthy story out of the negative.
Absolutely. I think that, so I come back to the idea of getting lots of press releases and companies telling me that their app's the next best thing, which it may well be. But I don't like to start from that. I like to sit back and think, what's the problem? What are we facing here? Why is air pollution such a big deal? And who's got it right? Where's the cleanest city in the world? What are they doing? Why is Wellington or Tallinn got no problems with air pollution? What are they doing that we might learn from? Or to sit and think about migration, you know, one of the biggest issues of the past 5 years. Why are people so kind of tetchy and concerned about migration? Why have they got this impression of the migrant as a threat? Could we show them perhaps the other side of sort of, we did 7 decades of migration, the 7 migrants who changed Britain, those kinds of things. So starting with the problem, for me, is always the best. If you start with a solution, but I think that you very quickly might get blinded or not actually appreciate that it might not be the solution.
But of course, in reporting the solution, you have to explain the problem that required the solution in the first place.
Absolutely. And then you get into more subtle forms of the genre, which is, why doesn't every news article, however negative, have some solution stitched into it? If you're writing the next piece about climate change, about temperature, about carbon in the atmosphere, and you've given someone 600 words of why this century is heading for great peril, why can't you then segue into, but here are the 4 technologies that are attracting billions of dollars at the moment, that are experiencing exponential increase, and that could address the matter somehow. And I think that's probably the next stage of this form of news, because having a website that's got bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news, good news is a bit like your TV programs back in the day that would have loads and loads and loads of negative news, and finally. It's justifying all the negativity by dropping in something a little bit tokenistic. I think we need to stitch it much more.
It needs to be seeded
much
through all
more.
the coverage.
But I would say, and I've said this to you before, sometimes it is like pushing water up a hill. Newsrooms are very traditional, very strong-minded, and have very strong culture. And changing that, well, I haven't managed it in 3 years, and I think you didn't manage it in however long at the BBC. It's hard work.
I know that you have a personal as well as a professional reason for wanting to embrace constructive journalism in the way that you have. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I've been in news nearly 30 years, and when I was turned on to this, I'd spent 20, 25 years dealing with some of the biggest and most upsetting and desperate stories of recent times, from terrorist bombings. And I spent a long time living in Moscow and in Eastern Europe, which aren't easy places to operate in, Bosnia, at the end of the war. And I think I just got to that stage in life in my mid-40s where I wanted to believe that there were better stories to tell. I wanted to believe that that not everything is desperate. Actually, if you look at a lot of metrics, life's never been better. And when I say that, I'm not disregarding the deep difficulties that many communities experienced this time. But objectively, we've never lived longer. We've never been this prosperous. Our health has never been better if you disregard the blip of the past few months. And so I felt that there was a responsibility to be more honest about that. And the other thing I would say, I did have quite a serious mental health episode 10 years ago. And I don't put that down to the work that I did, but I would definitely say that editing The Upside is a great tonic for mental health. I mean, it really does.
So writing it as well as reading it is good for you.
Absolutely. It really does make you feel, and also it makes you engaged. It makes you active. It made me, I don't want to go into personal details, but contribute more, lending money to the developing world, which I'm involved with in a small way, and really trying to support some of the organizations that we've come across that we think are doing great work. And that's a tremendous feeling.
Where do you see constructive journalism in 5 or 10 years' time? Is it a bandwagon whose time has come, or not quite yet?
I think it is a bandwagon whose time has come. I don't think it'll be easy, because I think that news still thinks that its core product is what drives its commercial and its editorial model. And it's not wrong about that. I come back to some of The Guardian's traffic numbers. On the upside, we get tremendous readership for our stories. But then you look at a Donald Trump story, and it's by an order of magnitude even greater. People cannot resist going towards that that kind of that salacious headline. They can't resist it. But I think that where constructive news will become important for all big players is in brand, is in how we grow our organization and how we bring more paying readers into our midst, because this is the future. This business model is shot, really. I mean, it's absolutely hit the skids this year. The advertising supported model is very much in question. And we're all falling back on the basic idea that if we're going to survive, if we're going to thrive, we've got to get readers to pay. We've got to get readers to come in and to pay for what we produce. And with the best will in the world, clickbait won't do that. What will do that is building your brand as a purveyor of serious news and serious hope. And readers have come back to me in my role as head of membership at The Guardian and said, you know, we love The Guardian for the news that it does, but also for the fact that it gives us a little bit of something to cling on to. And that's why I think that all news organisations are going to have this in their mix.
So embracing constructive journalism, partly because, as you and I would agree, it is the right thing to do, but also for hard-nosed commercial reasons as well, to bring back people who've been lost to news, to various media outlets, and who've maybe turned off news in favour of social media, to bring them back to mainstream journalism, because there is definitely an appetite out there for it.
Yeah, I think that news, traditional news, is a traffic magnet. It brings people in, but they will bounce. The thing that makes people stay and fall in love with you is when you've got that rounded mix. You've got that mix of like, this is where things are going wrong, but this is what we can do about it. If we sort of pull together, they feel part of, people want to feel part of something. And when you give them that, they feel part of a community that's trying to make a difference.
And social media isn't always good at that.
Oh, don't let's start about social media. I've got 3 teenagers, you know, it just drives me to distraction. I'm desperately worried about the quality of information that our young people get. I do think this year's been good for reversing that trend. I think people have really pulled back and tried to seek out places where they can trust. Can I trust this information? It's important to me to be able to trust information about COVID-19, because you know what? I might die from it. So I'm not going to believe that post on Twitter. I'm going to go back to, you know, the BBC or The Guardian or Times or The Economist and really get to learn about, you know, the salient facts of this. So that's been great, but we haven't cracked the social media conundrum just yet. And that's probably an entirely different discussion.
So work in progress, but starting with your 3 kids.
Starting with my 3 kids, yeah. They don't really read The Guardian. They don't read constructive news. They're kind of a very hard sell. And that will be the next revolution. What are news teams going to do to engage, to educate, to retain the younger generation? Because they just don't consume news anyway like we used to.
I remember many years ago, my daughter, when she was in her teens, saying that she and her friends didn't watch news. An interesting phrase, because it doesn't give us hope.
Really? Yeah.
And in these days, when people are talking, you know, not just because of COVID, but in general terms about the mental health problems that young people are facing, hope, as represented by constructive journalism, could actually be a key ingredient in helping them to overcome what mental difficulties they've got.
Absolutely. I come back to this amazing article that we published this year. None of us actually knew much about it before we published it. It was by a German historian, Rutger Bregman, who had a book that came out this year. You might remember him from Davos, creating a bit of a storm. He wrote this article about how he'd investigated and come across a real-life case of he'd come across a real-life case of the Lord of the Flies in the South Seas. And of course, we all know from the book that in the Lord of the Flies, it quickly descends into savagery, bullying, and the nastiest side of human nature you can imagine. But in the real-life version, cooperation, collaboration was what enabled these boys to survive and be rescued, and they ended up back in Australia. And not only was it one of the best read pieces, just in terms of numbers who came to read that piece, it also, everyone who came, we could tell, read it to the bottom by the amount of time they stayed on the article. And what's more, and this is more important from the point of view of constructive, hopeful news, it was our most donated. It was the piece that generated the most donations for us this year. So our model is very much around, you come to our site, if you like what you see, you can join us as a supporter or a contributor so that we can keep the site open so everyone can read. And as a result of reading that article, the numbers of people who clicked through to give us money was extraordinary. And that, again, just proof positive that this kind of work is both editorially necessary and commercially triumphant.
Constructive journalism is a win-win.
It's a win-win, Sir Martin, and you started it all off a long time ago. So it's a great honour for me to be sat here talking to you today.
Mark, it's fantastic to hear the logic that has gone through the conversion of The Guardian to this kind of journalism. Really exciting, and congratulations, and keep taking the tablets.
I'll do my best.
Keep up the great work.
I'll do my best. Good to talk.